Hello and welcome to our fun little study group for PP 5340, Introduction to Public Policy and Management. Today we are diving headfirst into Chapter 1 of our required text, Race and Social Equity. And it starts with a really fascinating question. What if an entire government could feel nervous? We're going to be exploring this powerful idea called a nervous area of government, and it helps explain why making progress on some of our toughest social issues can feel so difficult. So, let's get right into it. The core idea of this chapter is what the author calls a nervous area of government. But, to really get what that means for a huge organization, we first have to bring it back down to a personal level. We have to think about what it means for us. Just think about it for a second. That feeling you get right before a huge presentation, or maybe a really tough conversation. It's a very physical thing, right? A very real sensation. The book points out all these classic signs. You get sweaty palms, maybe a knot in your stomach. It's hard to focus. It's basically our body screaming at us that we are, and I'm quoting here, no longer in a comfortable state. We have all been there. It's totally universal. And here is where things get really interesting. This is the big pivot. The author asks, what if that very personal, very human feeling isn't just for individuals? What if an entire government agency, the whole shebang, could become collectively nervous? And that question leads us right to the core definition. A nervous area of government is basically a policy area that is so packed with historical baggage and emotional discomfort that it just paralyzes the organization. It makes it incredibly hard to make any real progress. And the book's main argument is that racial equity is maybe the best example of this. What's so fascinating is that this isn't just some abstract theory somebody cooked up. The term actually came directly from a senior administrator in Wisconsin. They were trying to put words to the intense difficulty they were having just trying to talk about racial disparities in their own welfare program. It came from the real world. So, if we accept this idea that a whole organization can be nervous, then how does that actually work? What does it look like? Well, the author gives us a really helpful 4-part framework to kind of dissect the anatomy of this anxiety. You can think of this model as an anatomy lesson for how an organization gets anxious. We're going to break down the 4 key factors: the external environment, the senior leaders, the public servants on the front lines, and maybe, most importantly, the organization's core values. First up, you've got the external environment. This is where the pressure usually starts. It could be a political campaign making promises, or a lawsuit from a group like the ACLU that forces a legal review. Or it could be grassroots movements creating this moral pressure for change. These are the triggers coming from the outside world, banging on the door. Next, you have the senior administrators. These are the folks at the top, right? They control the money, the staff, the resources. They're like translators who decide how the organization is going to respond to all those external triggers. And here's the key. Their leadership can either calm the organization's nerves or, frankly, make them a whole lot worse. Then you've got the public servants, the people who actually do the work and deliver the services. A political scientist named Michael Lipsky gave them a famous name: street-level bureaucrats. We're talking about police officers, teachers, social workers. It's their thousands of small daily decisions that are where policy actually becomes reality for people. And this quote just brilliantly nails their power. Lipsky's point is that these frontline workers hold the keys to a dimension of citizenship. Think about it. Who gets a warning versus who gets arrested? Who gets extra help in school versus who gets suspended? These aren't small things. They literally define a person's relationship with the government. And that brings us to the final piece, which the author says is the single most important factor of all: organizational values. What does the agency's culture truly prioritize? Is it all about efficiency and saving money? Or is equity seen as just as important? This underlying value system is what ultimately determines whether conversations about race are even allowed to happen. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but social equity is about a lot of things: gender, class, disability. So why the intense focus specifically on race? And that's a fair question, which the book addresses head on. The author frames this whole discussion with this incredibly powerful quote from W.E.B. Du Bois from all the way back in 1900. The argument is that while lots of inequities exist, the color line has been this uniquely stubborn and fundamental challenge in American society, and that makes it a particularly powerful source of this governmental nervousness. So to really analyze this, the book moves us beyond thinking about individual prejudice, one bad person, to this concept of structural racism. This is a framework that looks at how the systems themselves, the policies, the institutional habits, even cultural norms, can create and continue racial disparities, no matter what the intentions of the people inside that system are. And here's a really helpful way the book helps us understand this. It compares what it calls discrimination in contact versus discrimination in contract. So contact is about individual interactions, one person treating another unfairly, like in a housing deal. But contract is about the rules of the game itself, the policies and structures, like historical redlining, that basically hardwire bias into the whole system. And because the problem is so often structural, the authors argue that colorblind approaches just don't work. As the scholars Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Torres put it, pretending not to see race in a world that is very color-conscious doesn't actually solve inequities. It usually just leads to paralysis rather than action. Okay, so if the problem is structural and just talking about it makes the government nervous, what's the solution? Where do we go from here? The book argues it really comes down to reframing social equity as a core professional value. This idea was really pushed by a scholar named H. George Fredrickson. He argued that for way too long, public administration has only cared about two things: economy and efficiency. Is it cheap and is it fast? He said we needed a third pillar: social equity. The whole idea is that fairness in how we deliver services is just as fundamental as saving money or being quick. But how do you actually measure something that can feel as big and abstract as equity? Well, to make it more concrete, the National Academy of Public Administration gives us this four-step framework. You can look at procedural fairness, you can look at access, the quality of services, and, of course, the actual outcomes for people. All of this, the nervousness, the structure, the values, it all builds up to one final, really critical takeaway. It all comes down to learning to ask a different kind of question.
George Fredrickson said, it's not enough for us to ask if a program is good or effective. The real question, the much more important question, is for whom is this program effective or good? And that tiny shift in perspective is the whole point. It's a question that is designed to push right through that nervousness and get to the heart of social equity. And it's a question for all of us to really think about.